Thank you, Helen. If I speak like this, there are some microphones here. Can you hear me well enough? Great. So we are small but perfectly formed, which is lovely, because one of the ground rules for today is that this can be as conversational as you wish it to be. So do put your hand up and jump in if you have comments and questions about what we talk about. And we don't have a very set agenda about what we're going to talk about. I'll explain how the evening is going to run. So we're going to start by briefly telling you just a little bit more about ourselves, just so you know who we are. We're not going to spend too long doing that. And then Andrew is going to set the scene for us. And Andrew, you're going to relate this in part to this wonderful book that you've written, but that will set the scene for the discussion that we'll have subsequently, for which we have no particular agenda. One thing we were quite interested to know was whether anyone in the audience works for the NHS at the moment. Is there anyone who actually works for the NHS here? Hello? Yes.
Honorary contractors do data science work for us.
Oh, great. Amazing. Lovely. Thanks for coming along. There was someone else at the back there.
I partly work, but partly do research as well. So.
Yeah, wonderful. So do people, is there anyone who has family members who work for the NHS as well? So a fair few of you, interestingly. So you can see it's beginning to weave into the fabric of society very rapidly, you know, with 1 degree of separation. And of course, as you've already heard from Helen, I suspect everybody in the room, without making assumptions, has encountered the NHS at some stage of their life. And that's why it's so important to all of us in this country. And we're going to hear a little bit more about that from Andrew in a moment. So by way of background, I've got the honour of chairing it today. I'm delighted to do so. And I, as you heard, I'm now the warden of Keble, which is the equivalent of Helen's job at St Anne's. And you might think, why on earth does that qualify me to chair this panel? And the reason probably is that I spent the previous 33 years of my life working in the NHS. I was an acute hospital physician and I was a specialist in infectious diseases at one of the large London teaching hospitals. So I really dedicated my working life up till now to working in the NHS and feel a very particular relationship to it, which we may explore over the course of the evening. Helen.
Hello, I'm Helen Salisbury and I'm a GP just down the road at Observatory Medical Practice. And I actually didn't start out as a doctor. I started out reading philosophy, psychology and physiology, the wonderful PPP degree, which doesn't exist anymore. But halfway through that, I thought, but what am I going to do? And decided I needed to follow my sister into medicine, which I finished my degree and I went and did that. And so I did various things as a doctor, but for the last 22 years, I've been 24 years, I've been a GP. And so I owe my career to the NHS, and I am quite passionate. I hate that word. I'm very enthusiastic, I'm very fervent about the NHS and the promise that it gives for equal healthcare for all, regardless of the depths of your pockets. And I will go to my grave fighting for that one.
But you set out your position very early there.
Absolutely.
For sure. I'm going to go now to Charlotte, only because Andrew, you're going to do the introduction, so you can introduce yourself at the beginning of your introduction. Okay, so Charlotte.
Hi everybody, my name is Charlotte Williams. I'm in one of the several hundred other professions in the health service that isn't medicine, so I'm actually a professional manager in the health service. I read biochemistry at St Anne's, and having done work experience as a GP actually, at school realised that it wasn't probably what I wanted to do, but I knew I wanted to do something medical, scientific, probably public service. but looked at civil service, looked at the NHS, and found the NHS Graduate Management Training Scheme. So I joined straight from St Anne's and went into the NHS 22 years ago on the Graduate Management Scheme, and worked mainly in hospitals for the early parts of my career. And then I went into public health and commissioning, and then I worked in big change programmes to restructure the way services ran across London, and went to the National NHS England Strategy Unit for a while, working on some national policy. So although it's management, it wasn't always management as you might imagine in terms of running services and running budgets, that sort of thing. And I've worked in the South East, I've worked in London, and I work in the East of England. So I'm on the board of what's called a super large NHS hospital group at the moment as Chief Strategy Officer. And I'm actually moving to a new role next month as a Deputy Chief Executive in Cambridgeshire. So I've been in for quite a long time, either always paid by the NHS to do something, although I have worked in the university sector and in social enterprise as well, because the NHS isn't all delivered by NHS organisations. So I've had a bit of experience of different models of working, but have committed most of my career to working in the NHS. Really delighted to be here.
Great, thank you very much, Helen. So Andrew, both your own introduction and then segue straight into setting the scene for us, if that's okay.
Absolutely, yeah, I'll try my best. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Andrew Seaton. I'm a historian. I'm a historian of modern Britain and the history of medicine. And I was based at St Anne's as a junior research fellow in history between 2021 and 2023 when I was finishing the book that's in front of you that I'm going to talk a little bit about this evening. And I really enjoyed my time here at St Anne's for all the reasons that Helen described. I did my undergraduate degree at Oxford, but I never set foot in St Anne's. And when I did, I was immediately struck by how welcoming and a lovely environment it was, and what a great history it has. So it's so fantastic that there are weeks like this that can be there to support the college as it's moving forward with its goals, and I'm really honoured to play a part in that. So this is the segue bit here. I don't know how smooth it is, but this evening I've been tasked to take 7 to 8 minutes to talk about the book, which is good which is difficult in some ways. The NHS is 75 years old. The book is 300 and something pages. It's quite hard to do that in 7 to 8 minutes. But what's quite good about it is that it means I won't be able to say everything, so therefore you can buy the book. And I will be selling copies afterwards if I've not completely put you off. So I thought what I'd start with is just a little bit of a kind of scene setting. Where did the NHS come from? And then I'm just going to very briefly talk about sort of why I wrote the book, what the book argues, and then sort of 3 things that kind of surprised me as I was researching and writing the book. Hopefully you feel the same way in terms of them being new to you. So the NHS, as most people in the room will know, was born, as it were, on the 5th of July 1948. It came about as part of a kind of radical programme that the Labour government elected after the Second World War to kind of build a universal welfare state to both kind of escape the horrors of unemployment that had blighted Britain in the 1930s and the kind of ravages of the war that Britain had just experienced. The Labour Party was elected to kind of enact this social welfare programme to kind of provide security for all British people from, as the phrase goes, from the cradle to the grave. And the National Health Service, although we often think of it today as this kind of, the absolute, the jewel in the crown of the welfare state, at this point, it was very much figured as just kind of part of this wider package of welfare measures that were passed in that moment. The legislation for the National Health Service, both in England and Wales, those 2 systems being part of one act, and then also in Scotland and Northern Ireland, was passed by Aneurin Bevan, another name that will be familiar to you. He was the Welsh Labour Minister of Health and Housing in that Labour government, very charismatic orator. He came from the mining valleys of South Wales. He was a coal miner himself as a teenager and rose up to become the Minister of Health and Housing in that government. And he really believed that to provide the most security and to extend the kind of the sort of marvels of modern medicine to the whole population, you needed a coordinated healthcare system that had no insurance component, no direct payments, and really provided a kind of universal healthcare service, everything from, you know, hospital treatments, GP visits, but also things like dentistry and so on at the time, as part of one system. And that system itself needed to be funded by general taxation and also organised by the government. So this was a moment in British history where there was a lot of faith placed in the state and its capacities to organise and provide for its citizens, probably more faith than we have today. So that's kind of where the NHS came from. In writing the book, you know, the NHS is as Mike's questions alluded to, it's this institution that's kind of in all of our lives and interwoven in all of our, you know, most people's families. It's the largest employer in the UK. It's the largest employer in Europe. It's the 5th largest employer in the world. It keeps an eclectic company with the Chinese Red Army, the US Department of Defense, as well as Walmart and McDonald's. And then it's the NHS. Consider it all its employees as one employer. So it's this huge, vast institution that obviously we all rely on and interact with. And, you know, most people will know something about the NHS's history, that it came about after the Second World War. They might know the name of Aneurin Bevan, particularly if you're from Wales, where lots of things are named after him. There's a play on in London at the National Theatre with Michael Sheen at the moment, where, you know, he's playing Aneurin Bevan. So it does kind of feature in popular culture in a really significant way. And in writing the book, I wanted to try and capture something of that place in Britain, of the NHS's place in Britain and in people's lives in the past, beyond it just being this kind of, you know, a health system that delivered medical care, although of course it is also that. The NHS is also important because in a way it tells the story of Britain since the Second World War. And that's kind of one of the things that I try and do in the book is talk about, you know, how does the NHS tell us a story, for instance, about immigration into Britain and you know, the kind of diverse population that we have today. You know, there are all these kinds of issues that the NHS slots into. So that was kind of one of the things that I wanted to capture in the tone of the book. And why I wrote it is sort of two reasons. The first was actually kind of episodic. It was after watching the 2012 London Olympic Games, which feels like yesterday, depressingly, is about 12 years ago. Any of you, did anybody see the opening ceremony of or remember that? You remember the kind of centrality of the National Health Service in that opening ceremony, this kind of projection to the rest of the world of what it meant to be British. So you had these kind of things like the Beatles and, you know, James Bond and the royal family and so on, but you also had the National Health Service. And, you know, at the time, I didn't really think much of it. It felt normal, as I'm sure it did to most people within Britain. But kind of reading some of the reviews of the ceremony the next day, particularly the American commentary, they were like, oh, yeah, we really liked the ceremony. You know, we liked the bit about the Industrial Revolution or whatever, but we didn't get why you'd put a state healthcare system in an Olympic opening ceremony. And it sort of got me thinking, I was like, actually, there's a good point there. Like, how did that come about historically to be the case? You know, other countries didn't seem to do that with events like an Olympic opening ceremony. So there was a kind of moment then in 2012 which sort of got me thinking about the history of the NHS in that way. And then secondly, the other reason is sort of similar to many people in the room and on the panel this evening, my own personal connections to the health service. So my mum is retired now, but she was a cleaner in the NHS. Two of her sisters were nurses. this was a kind of institution that, through employing members of my family, sort of always been there, and sort of, trying to take the opportunity to think sort of historically about this institution was something that really appealed to me. So the book answers two questions. The first I've alluded to already, sort of why did the NHS take on this significance? Why did it become this kind of, totemic part of British public life? The NHS consistently appears at the top of opinion polls about the thing it named as the thing that makes British people most proud to be British, ahead of, the royal family or fish and chips or the armed forces or whatever it might be. It's consistently at the top of those polls, no matter the crisis that it seems to be facing. And the second question related to that idea of crisis is, why did the NHS survive? Why did this part of that kind of welfare program after the Second World War that I started with, things like mass council housing, public industries like coal and water and all that kind of infrastructure, a lot of which fell away in the 1980s and 1990s, particularly under the governments of Margaret Thatcher. Why was it that the NHS not only survived, but took on ever greater prominence in public life? So why did that happen compared to those other parts of the welfare state and public industries? And in the book, I start from the position that it wasn't inevitable that either of those two things would happen. It wasn't inevitable that one day people would say that the NHS was the thing that made them proud to be British. Indeed, there are sort of various critics of the health service throughout its history. And that's one of the things that I try and do in the book as well, is try and give a sense that not everyone had sort of uncritically and universally welcomed the health service when it arrived. It's always been subjected to various kind of controversies and criticisms, from sort of funding to medical scandals, all kinds of things. And as a result of that, it took work, is what I argue. It took work to promote the NHS, to kind of package it as this thing that, and to insert it into public life in a kind of deliberate way, to adapt it to social change, to counter the opponents, the very many opponents that the NHS has had over its history, and also to deliberately tie it to Britishness itself. This was a kind of deliberate thing that happened over time. And I show the many hands that were involved in making those things happen, from sort of campaigners and trade unions and politicians to doctors and patients, experts like architects and economists, and also cultural figures like novelists and filmmakers. The NHS has always played a really important part of popular culture as well. So the argument of the book then is that those outcomes that I started with were not inevitable. It took work by the supporters of the NHS to make them happen, and they built over time. It wasn't there fully formed in 1948 when the NHS began. So just three things then that kind of surprised me while researching and writing the book. As I've said, the NHS is this topic that's sort of constantly in our newspapers or on the radio or on the TV, and there's this real tendency, I think, to see it as this institution through the lens of 2024 that's always been loved and cherished, or to tell a kind of narrative of this sort of once great institution that's kind of fallen into disrepair and is on the precipice of collapse. But there's actually many surprising stories and kind of ruptures in the NHS's past than we might think from our viewpoint of 2024. So the first one is that people did not celebrate the NHS in 1948 in the way that they did now. So in the first chapter, I talk a lot about opinion polling and looking at people's perceptions of the NHS when it was first put on the table and passed in that moment after the Second World War. And certainly a majority of people favoured the idea of something like the National Health Service, although it had different names, including state medicine. That was another term that was used. There also was a considerable amount of apprehension about what it would mean for the government to take over all the hospitals, to become intimately involved in the provision of healthcare, And of course, we all know, the doctors and the BMA opposed the onset of the National Health Service, but also for those reasons, because they were worried that it would be this kind of statist machine that kind of told you which doctor to go to and what treatments you could have. So, but there were also large numbers of the public that also felt that way. And that was quite surprising to me. And this again sort of builds into the sort of point I made a moment ago, that again, this was a historical process. It took time for British people to come to embrace this institution that in the way that they did. A really good example of that is the tradition of that we have now of celebrating the National Health Service's birthday on the 5th of July, even referring to it as a birthday. Again, we might think that this was something that people did in the 1940s. That's not the case. It's actually a very recent tradition and came about in a really significant way in the 1980s, when under the governments of Margaret Thatcher, there was a real sense that the NHS was about to be privatised completely, and trade unions kind of started this tradition of marking the NHS's anniversary of the 5th of July. So you can see, and under New Labour, that was sort of made sort of national policy, and now we have ceremonies in Westminster Abbey and so on and so forth. So you can see there how some of these kind of traditions are quite recent, and it took active work for them to make them happen. The second thing that surprised me is this disjunction. I'm sure we're going to talk about this in our conversation, between what we have in our minds as the National Health Service, as this kind of bounded thing, and the reality, which has always been a lot more sort of complicated and diffuse than that idea might lead us to believe. New Labour politicians in particular were very fond of referring to the NHS as a monolith in their speeches, as a sort of basis for their own reforms. You see these phrases by people like Alan Milburn, who was Secretary of State for Health in the 2000s, who would describe the NHS as a 1940s system in a 21st century world. So you'd see the sense of the NHS being this kind of monolithic, almost Stalinist kind of institution in the 40s and 50s, and only the politicians of today realise that patients want choice and it has to be decentralised and so on. But again, if you look at the history, the NHS has always been this kind of thing that looks very different in different parts of the country. And sort of one of the ways that I show that in the book is through things like health centres, for example, which took off after the 1960s in some places quicker than others. So, for example, in Northern Ireland, in the 1970s, most of general practice was being done in health centres in a way that it wasn't in other parts of the country. So that's just one example of how there's this disjunction between the kind of reality, which is quite messy and diffuse of what the NHS is, and then this cultural idea of the NHS as this kind of single bounded thing, the NHS in our minds. Thirdly and finally, lots to say about this topic, but some touch on this, but the relationship between the NHS and immigration is absolutely fascinating. The way that the NHS came about in this moment when Britain was shedding its empire and reliant on a large number of people who came from many countries that formed that empire, now understood to be in the Commonwealth. Lots of statistics on this, but in the early 70s, a third of all doctors in the National Health Service were trained overseas, principally among them places like India and Pakistan, but also countries like Nigeria and so on. Nurses from Jamaica, obviously, but also nurses from places like Ireland, for example. So there was this kind of interlocking of the NHS, which we think about as this kind of quintessentially national British institution, but it's actually a very global institution, and it remains the case still today. That was very, very surprising to me, and it was really interesting and rewarding for the book, being able to speak to a couple of those people, who immigrated into the UK in the 60s and stayed and worked within it. So I'm going to end it there, but hopefully, sort of giving you a sense of both where the NHS come from, some of the kind of surprising stories that are there in the NHS's history that I think through our media landscape, we don't really get much of a sense of. And hopefully there's a kind of a value to history, and doing this kind of work and help us puncture or maybe reframe some of the ways that we talk about an institution like the NHS. And also just a kind of more optimistic general take that the NHS allows us to think about lots of things in British history beyond itself, right? Like, if you're interested in novels or architecture or immigration or gender or whatever it might be, the NHS is a great institution to think through all of those things, and I'm sure we'll be doing that in the discussion that follows. But thanks so much for listening.
Andrew, that was absolutely fantastic. Well, that's a fantastic introduction. I mean, you framed some really interesting ideas and questions there. Where to start, really? Charlotte, can I come to you to begin with? I mean, either just pick what your reflections on that are. I'd be very, very interested to hear, and don't feel bounded by this. This idea of the NHS being really quite a messy organisation with lots of moving parts that is rather different in different parts of the country, and the idea that there is this thing, the National Health Service, once you start interrogating it, seems to sort of crumble quite quickly. And you obviously have a lot of insight into that in terms of from strategy and planning point of view. And whether that's a good thing, a bad thing, I mean, heterogeneity can be a good thing because it can drive a lot of innovation, but at the same time, there may be tremendous inconsistency in care between different parts of the country. For example, reaching different parts of our population may be very difficult and so on. So I don't know whether you want to go there or whether there was something you wanted to say before that, Charlotte, but can I ask you to start with that?
Of course, yeah. Very happy to talk about that, and I think it's probably something which has become harder to distinguish since we had the blue lozenge. You broke your book as well, that blue lozenge brand of the NHS, which now you can see on a high street pharmacy, see it on the back of a bus, you can see it around the place. So it's almost like the NHS is this family of organisations that are authorised, to provide care, and that lozenge is guarded very, very closely. You're not allowed to put that on unless you are actually under a certain contractual obligation. So the NHS has become very aware of its kind of corporate identity, which I think is aiming to kind of keep that idea of it being a strong unifying brand and having very high public trust. So that's something NHS England is really focused on, is keeping that level of trust by only having certain authorised actors able to use that brand, which I think is, again, quite an interesting development talked about in the book. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I think the idea that the NHS addresses the question of equity or inequity is a really interesting one, because I think that's probably what draws a lot of us, as Helen described, to working in the service, is that you don't really have to answer the question why you work in the NHS, because the values are right there. So that's probably the thing which has made a big attraction for me, is I rarely have to question, one job that I'm in. People understand that straight away, or they don't feel authorised to ask you why, because this is so obvious that it's a good thing to do. So being a manager is a different situation, because obviously managers are seen as superfluous to requirements in the health service. So sometimes you have a little bit of a, okay, let's just move on type of conversation about that as a profession. But it's not equitable in lots and lots of ways, partly because funding model will never be right. You might say, well, Greater Manchester's more deprived, that needs more money than rural Lincolnshire, and every GP I've ever met will tell you that they're underfunded for the nature of their population, and they've got the most deprived population in the UK, and they don't need more money from the health service. And I'm sure that's true. I'm sure that's absolutely true. But the NHS is a function not only of the services that are commissioned and delivered, but also how able people are to access those. And particularly with the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen how different people's experiences of access to healthcare are. So you've got health inequalities in the population, you've got healthcare inequalities in terms of being able to take up the services that are provided. So we know people who are wealthier are much better able to stay in contact with services, follow a treatment regime, and have a better outcome from the care, even if the care that's delivered is the same. So for me, the NHS can only ever be equitable if it's working with the rest of the public sector and society to try to make sure that we understand the public and the population better. Yes, you're right, and there are a lot of transaction points within the health service. People who buy care, people who deliver care, people who deliver care under a contract from somebody else who delivers care. And there's some of them may be independent legally, some of them may be NHS legally, but ultimately it's all in pursuit of the same aim. But that can introduce levels of discomfort if that reaches into perhaps the pharmaceutical industry, for example, on whom we would not have the treatments we have for HIV or for COVID without the active involvement of the pharmaceutical industry. But I've met doctors who tell me they won't have a pen at a conference if it's got a pharma company name on it because they feel that they'll get in trouble for doing that. So we're not quite clear on where we stand on some of these collaborations. But yeah, there's only over 400 organisations, I think, NHS, fully NHS, or delivering health services. So I work in a trust now. I'm going to start working in an NHS trust again next month. It will be very different, and people will behave differently, and processes will be very different. And understanding, what the blue lozenge really means on the top of a letter or on an email, it's not always the same from a patient's perspective. But I think our job is really to try to protect patients from worrying too much about that and make sure that they still have confidence and trust in the care they get from the NHS. And that's what I always try to do.
No, thank you. I mean, Helen, you're a frontline GP, and you must encounter these health inequalities every moment of your working life. And I wonder whether you could speak to your ability to address any of these and what your key relationships are with other public bodies and stakeholders that actually have interplay with this, because it's so fundamental to what the NHS is trying to do, or maybe should be trying to do, which is to try and address some of these healthcare inequalities.
Absolutely. To pick up on Charlotte's point about, GPs will always tell you that they're not getting enough of the pie. But I would say that within general practice, the pie is very badly divided through formulas that came in 2004, particularly, so that practices like mine in leafy North Oxford are really very much better resourced than the other side of town. And there's almost a decade difference in life expectancy between here and Blackbird Leys, and there's almost twice that of healthy life expectancy without disability between those. And that's a scandal, really, that there is such a difference depending on where you're born and where you live. And some of that is absolutely about healthcare to which you have access. A huge amount of it is about something called the social determinants of health. So your health partly depends on the healthcare you get, but it hugely depends on the food you get, the air you breathe, the mold housing you're in. All of those things probably account for 90% of your health, and actual healthcare to 10%. So whenever one starts thinking about health inequalities, you have to go back to thinking about health in all policies, health in your housing policy, health in your transport policy, and why are people growing up less healthy in somewhere that's 3 miles away than they are here, and even more across the country. Actually, within the NHS, I'm quite interested in Charlotte's talk about the logo, the lozenge, because this concept of choice, which was made much of at the beginning of the NHS, this idea that it's time to choose your doctor, try to make sure everyone thinks they've got a choice about these things, and made huge amounts of by the kind of the New Labour thing, lots of emphasis on choice. But with that also came this diversification of providers, which was then even more accelerated with the Lansley changes in 2013, any qualified provider, really anyone can bid to run an NHS contract and have that logo. And there's a really interesting question about actually, did that help? So in my seat as a GP, I'm having to interact with a lot of private organisations now who now have the contract to, so I can't refer to an orthopaedic surgeon, I have to refer to a private company which triages my patients and decides where they should go. I don't know whether that ends up costing less for the health service. I do know my patients aren't happy about the delay that brings in, and that's for physiotherapy. It's for all sorts of other things that have been taken over by private companies, and there is a concern, I think, about whether big companies are extracting profit and reducing the amount of service that goes to patients. It's quite difficult as a GP talking about private companies because, as a GP, I'm a private business. Yeah? GPs were never sort of fully enfolded in the NHS embrace. I think rather they decided they'd rather not be. Thank you very much. And have always remained private contractors. Although we only have one contract, and that's to the NHS, they are technically still private businesses. There's a difference between GP small businesses where we only have one customer, which is the state, and we have lots of people we have to look after. And we are the people providing the service, so it comes back to us and it goes wrong. And much bigger corporations who have shareholders, where their duty is not just to their patients, but also to their shareholders. And it's been very interesting watching the comings and goings of private companies, big companies trying to run NHS services, particularly general practice services. And we're in a really strange position in which the fact that general practice is so badly funded is a protection over, against wholesale takeover by big companies like United Health and Centene and all the other American companies that would have dipped their toe in the water. Virgin did for a bit as well, but mostly run away again because they discovered they couldn't make any money. I don't know whether that actually answered your question, but
I don't know either,
territory.
but it was very interesting to listen to your experience. Andrew, when you were researching the book, I mean, did you find that there was a different, over time, that different parts of society felt very differently about the NHS? So that the support that you talk about, whether that reached into particular parts of society more than others. So, for example, at its foundation, was it people who were less affluent who really felt that newfound access to healthcare was something that they valued hugely? And was it richer people who could afford private healthcare at the time who were more resistant to it? And has that changed over time?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think so that broadly you see that trend, certainly when you look at kind of opinion polling and people's, looks at like diaries and letters and personal testimony and so on about it. The kind of middle classes, kind of some of them had a kind of more of a skepticism than working class people. But I think that wasn't entirely true. One of the very interesting things about it was also gender, and whether you were a man or woman affected also how you thought about the NHS. And part of the reason for that was that the system that existed before the NHS, the national insurance system in general practice, which was established in the early 20th century, and basically, if you paid in a certain amount of your pay packet, the government and your employer put in a bit of money, and it gave you access to what was known as the panel GP for free when you needed it. you only got that if you only got access to that if you were in work. Most people in full-time employment were men. So therefore they had exposure to state medicine, as it were. So they were kind of like, well, I've had, you know, you see it kind of in letters and stuff, they have prior experience with the state intervening in their medical affairs. So therefore it's not this kind of quantum leap to think about how that might work at something like an NHS. Whereas the wives of those men were excluded from that national insurance system. So you see, and they were much more, you know, reliant on sort of putting their hands into their own pockets and paying for care or using charity or whatever it might be. So you can see there how there was also kind of gender also played a role, which was very interesting. And you certainly see the middle classes become more warm more to the NHS over time, particularly as you get into like the late 50s, 60s. Now, and that middle class embrace of the NHS has often been described as something of a double-edged sword, because on one hand, for welfare services to survive, they work best if they cater for everyone in the population. And the reason for that is that they don't become stigmatized. They don't become stigmatized as something that just poor people do. And therefore, if they don't become stigmatized and middle class people use them, they're more likely to get funded and you know, smart people working with them and so on. So good thing that middle class people will use them. The bad side of it, so the argument goes, and this is something that a guy called Richard Titmuss, who was sort of a really influential figure in social policy around welfare in the 1960s, sort of internationally famous, he sort of started sort of doing these studies in the 60s that would describe what we would now call the kind of sharp elbowed middle classes, who are very good at sort of pushing their doctor for certain treatments or to be referred to the specialist at the hospital and so on, in a way that the working class patients were not as skilled at doing. So you can see there how they, you know, for some commentators, that middle class embrace of the NHS carried some costs. And, you know, we still live with that, I think, that this issue about, like, you know, your education level, going into the doctor's surgery and being able to ask things or not ask things. And, you know, that is something that I think there's still a lot of sociological work on that shows that dynamic.
No, thank you. I mean, we talked a little bit, we touched upon the complexity of the NHS as an organisation. And I don't know whether this resonates with people in the room, but I do think that from the consumer side of the NHS, it is incredibly difficult to navigate and to understand what next step you should take in the NHS as well. I don't know, do people in the room agree with that observation, that it can be very hard to navigate and find your way through? And that sometimes it's very unclear as a patient, and I can really see how education attainment as one measure would actually enable you to make so much more of the NHS in its current guise now. I mean, Charlotte, am I being unfair about that?
No, I don't think so. I think, unfortunately, the way we've set up a lot of healthcare delivery, I think is oriented from the services perspective rather than the user's perspective. So we've got often spent a lot of time persuading professionals who worked in a certain way to innovate and change what they do. And actually, those pain, that can often be the thing in terms of getting the NHS to change, is because of it's very traditional. So if you look at something like an outpatient clinic, it hasn't changed very much since probably the 1930s, to be honest. And I think I had a conversation with some clinicians a couple of weeks ago about the fact that there have been, in the average sort of later years consultant positions job, you know, career path, there may have been 17 annual plans, none of which has really changed the way that an operating theatre works or an outpatient, I mean, fundamentally. So we still have quite a lot of entrenched delivery models which are not necessarily adapting to the way that they might need to in order to help our population understand what happens, why it happens, and have a say in how it happens to them. And that's taking time to change. And I think it's quite a paternalistic view that we have to care because we care. We have to sometimes do things for them, to them, rather than think about how we can engage differently. So I increasingly think we need to work more with other areas of the sector that are more co-produced and do work in a more adaptive way, be that in education, or if you look at the way that local authority services work, they are much more, I mean, a lot of them are needs tested, which creates a bit of a power dynamic with the NHS and a different approach. You do risk when you make about stigmatisation around that. But they are much more integrated into people's daily lives. The NHS is sort of something which you probably need to increase the familiarity with and reduce the fear of to some extent in order to help people understand better. So I think there's definitely something that we can do as a partner in broader health of the population, helping people to understand how the NHS works. And also, you know, we haven't unfortunately seen significant improvements in what you might call kind of health behaviours and other things consistently. And I think there's lots of reasons potentially structurally for that. But I also think it's because the NHS hasn't done enough to get into the sort of health promotion and improvement narrative. So I think we're probably starting from a place that's has been or could have been monolithic and perhaps quite traditional in some of its professional approaches, not just from a clinician's perspective, from an administration perspective, a technology and digital perspective, and we need to adapt that better to people's visibility and feel more involved in the way the NHS works, and democratise the access points much more, so it links more in with people's daily lives and their broader understanding the services they can access. So that's why I think I hope that we can go with it. I think it's probably one of the only directions in which to go, because unless people can really understand their health and the way they can improve and work with the health service and other partners to improve their health, then you know we're not going to be able to continue because the model of service currently by is not. So it's essential to change that.
And I mean, have definitely got very much more complicated, and I absolutely agree with you that we need to do some co-design with patients so that people, you know, we can have something that patients know how to use, want to use, but it is really fantastically complicated, and it does feel like over the last few years there've been more and more kind of sticking plasters or little bolt-ons to try and make something work. So previously you might have called up your GP when there's something wrong, but now you might do NHS 111 or pharmacy first or your urgent care centre, or maybe you go to the emergency department. Or and if you do go to your GP, do you have to do it on the phone, or do you have to do it online, or maybe through the NHS app? And it may be that there is a room for plurality of approaches, but we do risk people being just very confused about what they're meant to do. And trying multiple things because actually they find they don't quite work. So I think it's monolith may not be a good thing, but we may have replaced it somewhat with confusion.
I mean, I'm very interested in this idea of a paternalistic service versus a patient-empowered service. And although at face value the latter seems very, very attractive, there's clearly a risk of building in further inequality. And maybe digital technology can save us in this way and really, really help us and really give people access where they haven't had it before. And now might be the moment, I think. We've been talking a lot. I wondered actually, I'm sure the panel, I'm going to speak for them. I'm sure the panel would be very happy to answer any questions at all from the audience. So does anyone want to jump in? We can carry on talking. I just thought I wanted to give you the opportunity to specifically. Sure, thanks very much. Could you speak really loudly? Sorry for the air conditioning.
So ripping off the theme of digital technology.
Yes.
I'm sure that's a priority from a strategy perspective, but then I'm sure there's lots of pushback from clinicians, perhaps. So how do you actually gel those together?
I don't like the way you said there's a lot of pushback from clinicians. I'm pointing at me. Is there pushback from clinicians?
Well, no two clinicians are the same. I suppose you can't generalise.
Yes, indeed.
I think we've cocked up a lot with digital technology in the NHS. We haven't exactly made it easy for people to have a lot of confidence in some of it. To be fair, we spent quite a lot of money trying to do things quite a commercial way. It's not always necessarily worked, and the data and digital landscape is, the point you just made, ridiculously complicated because my organisation, I'm responsible for digital as part of my board portfolio. We have about 500 different systems operating in our organisation. We have like a renal system, a preoperative assessment system, an electronic consent system, a theatre operational system. So you wouldn't start from here. I think is the first point, and so weaning people off the very specific tools that they currently use to think about technology as a generalised enabler, which is what we need to do. It's quite so I think people love their digital for the things that they do and the digital that they want to do, but that's what needs to change moving forward. So I don't necessarily push back against digital and technology, particularly as we're seeing a generational shift in that, in terms of particularly clinical professionals coming through with an expectation that be part of what we do. It's just that obviously we only have so many resources and so many things that we can do at one time. I think the point about inequality is an interesting one because obviously there are inequalities in terms of access to digital services, be that data packages, be that devices, be that connectivity in other ways. But I think it's about understanding that, like any other inequality that we introduce, be that place-based, be it, as you say, something around funding allocations, and it does, I think, create an opportunity to work with other partners and bring other parts of the kind of public estate in. So, using places where people already are to improve access. There's some great models, for example, of using the school waiting at the school gates as a way to engage women from certain communities, for example, in digital, using libraries, using supermarkets, etc. So I don't think it's necessarily any more complicated or more difficult. I see it more as creating an opportunity for engaging with patients. But we do have to concentrate on building confidence in the quality and safety of digital and technology that we're using.
I think general practice has had a better ride in terms of technology than hospitals, and has been more thoroughly computerised for quite a lot longer than hospitals. And the really simple exemplar is about prescribing. So if you've been to the GP recently, they will have said, and I'll send your prescription to your pharmacy, or it happens electronically. If you happen to be in York, I can send it to a pharmacy in York or whatever. Still doesn't happen from hospitals. Hospitals then write to the GPs and say, GP, will you prescribe? It's incredibly inefficient. So GPs have always loved their tech and do it well. I think there are interesting conversations to have and think about data privacy, what happens to your information, where it's used and what it's used for. And my final point on this really is just remembering that 8% of the population don't have smartphones, have never been online on a computer, do not do this. And that 8% will be, in that 8%, of them, a lot more than 8% are NHS users, because it's the elderly, and it's people with special needs, and it's people with enhanced care needs who are likely to be those people who don't do tech. So I think we have to, remember there are limits, and we will always have to have other ways of doing the work as well as technological ones.
Plus, of course, and I know you're not forgetting this in any way at all, but there is something about compassion and contact that we have to maintain in the system as well. That we mustn't let technology get in the way of that.
Absolutely, and it's very interesting. There's a big push at the moment for electronic triage of GP patients, so that people should, rather than ringing up and talking to a receptionist, write down what their problem is. I'm ongoing discussions within my practice, possibly tension, Because I feel really strongly that that first contact with the receptionist, part of their job is therapeutic. Part of their job is to make the person feel it's okay. We've got this. We can help. Don't worry. We're on it. You know, actually, if what you do is fill in some boxes on a computer form and send it in, do you feel heard? Do you feel safe? Do you feel, have you had that interaction, which is it's okay, the doctor will get you, they're going to call you, it's fine. I am worried that there's too much emphasis on the efficiency of cutting out humans. We need our humans at all sorts of levels, at the doctor and the nurse level, but also at the receptionist level. They do an important job.
Charlotte, you wanted to jump in?
Just to say that I think it's really worth keeping an eye on research with some of this, because interestingly, there are some good evaluations now that digital evaluates as effective, if not more so, particularly with younger people in relation to things like mental health. So it's less that it's not that you're talking to a bot, it's still a conversation that's facilitated in a way that's digital first. So as we're seeing generational shift, we're actually seeing some of these are more effective than face-to-face methods come through. And so I think they need to be properly evaluated with any other treatment methodology and not just assumed to be better. So I think that's one argument really for designing research and evaluation of digital, which we often forget to do, is that you learn that it works for certain groups in certain areas and not in others. And I think the other thing is that the extender effect of digital is really important. So there's some really good models in complex conditions like multiple sclerosis or neurological conditions where you may have to travel 4 hours on a bus to get to a specialist from, say, Cornwall, where the combination of the push and digital together and remote monitoring is actually facilitating much better outcomes. So it will help us to reach perhaps more deprived like coastal communities or rural communities, and showing some of the useful impacts there. So I think it's about trying to use structured research evidence like you would with medicines or like you would with other devices with digital to help support clinicians in making those decisions.
Yeah, lots to learn. I'm going to take the liberty, if I may. I know we're close to time, but someone did have their hand up at the back, and I would like to take that question. That's all right.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of talk recently on stuff about how the NHS needs reforming in order to be able to achieve better outcomes, and so a lot of time is spent talking about how old it's saying outdated 1940s healthcare system for developing in the 21st century world. We'll talk about that. Prevention and stuff like that, but these ideas aren't new. Like people have been talking about need to switch to prevention since before 2010. Digitalisation was going on under the Blair years. Patient choice has been a thing since talked about since the 1980s. Yeah, something is clearly happening. There's clearly those sources of ideas on what to do to improve the NHS, but there's clearly a problem in actually implementing them at any sort of pace. Just good ideas on how to improve healthcare systems just aren't happening at any sort of pace within the NHS. So I was wondering, how much do you think the veneration of the NHS, and particularly of doctors and nurses, compared to the problem managers, things like that, have potentially contributed to this?
Do you have any sort of historical view on that?
It's I mean, this is the surprising thing. I mean, like, we live in a world, as you say, where the NHS is reformed top to bottom every 2 years, and politicians promise that they won't, and then they do. From the period 1948 to 1973, there was not a single top to bottom administrative reform of the National Health Service. So the first 25 years of its existence, this did not happen. Once you get into, and for the rest of the 70s, wasn't really anything. Once you get into the 1990s, particularly with the internal market and so on, under Thatcher, and then especially under New Labour and since, it's a constant kind of revolution of reform. And so I think your point about, I think the thing about thinking about this as a historian is you don't want to be a sort of pedant where you're like, oh, well, people in the past have thought about that. But I think it's worth thinking about how do we challenge the narratives that we have about an institution like the NHS at the present. And I think what the reform point tells me is that this is an institution that inherently in its being has to be reformed every single year. History tells us that there are very, very long periods of time, longer than some people's lifetimes in this room, where it wasn't reformed. And, you know, therefore, if we think on those kinds of time frames, maybe not 25 years, but certainly in a slightly longer perspective, is there a lesson in that? I think the other thing I would say about reform is that what's really interesting about it is that the pace of reform is picked up as the NHS has become more and more prominent in public life. And I think those two things seem to feed on each other, because it seems to me that if you want to make a name for yourself as a politician, do a reform in the NHS, you're going to be in the news all week, good or bad. Like, we all know who Andrew Seaton is. Do we know anything else about Andrew Seaton? But we know about his NHS reform, and what's relevant about it, right? So you can make a name for yourself in doing it. And so I think there's something in that, but you don't want to take the position where you're completely against reform, right? Like, I think certainly given the current situation, there's going to have to be, you know, I don't know what the plan is for the next government, but, you know, there probably will be reforms of some description that will happen. And the final point I would make is that in this focus on reform, and this is something that both Helen and Charlotte have touched on, like we kind of, it's an obsession with the NHS when we think about health. And there is this kind of wider ecosystem, this more old-fashioned stuff about making sure that people have good pay and can put food on the table and have childcare and don't live in a mouldy home and aren't stressed and all, have clean air and clean water. You go on and on and on, right? And exercise and so on. There's more old-fashioned stuff that's actually outside of the remit of reform, and it's harder to do and takes place over a longer time duration, so therefore it's not politically interesting. But if you're interested in health outcomes, that's the stuff that books.
Well, I think that's a very good place to stop, actually, Andrew.
Sorry, I spoke too long.
Not at all. Not absolutely. You did not speak too long. You framed both ends of the discussion fantastically. Thank you for that. And thank you very much to the rest of the panel for all of